And welcome back. Still looking at chapter 27 in the new edition, and we're looking at learning objective, I think three, the way that I've redesigned them. Basically, what we're going to talk about is how the financial system coordinates savers and borrowers. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you. There we are. Okay. So again, what we're looking at is how do these financial intermediaries really coordinate savers and borrowers? And I keep using the word borrowers instead of investment so that we can keep it very clear what we're discussing here. So remember some time ago when we kind of split and started talking about the idea of financial intermediaries. Remember, we have savers on this side and we have borrowers on this side. Again, savers want to take their extra money. They want to use or perhaps put it into a saving account and get a return on their investment, or ROI. Okay. Borrowers need money and they're going to borrow it from banks, and they're going to use that money to really kind of buy capital, and they're going to invest in their business, perhaps, maybe buy a new house or build a new house. And so you want to think about the idea that borrowers are really part of that capital that we talked about way back in chapter 1 of those things that have an underlying asset available to them. What financial intermediaries or the financial system does is to take the savers, all of their extra money, if you will. Okay, so I'm going to put financial system here. And they're going to take the extra money from savers and give them some kind of interest rate for the use of their money. Okay, then they're going to take all of the extra money that savers have, they're going to bundle them together, perhaps, and then they're going to loan it back out to borrowers. And borrowers are going to pay an interest rate. So, for example, if savers might get a 6% return on their savings, return on the investment, but what's going to happen is that financial intermediary is going to loan that back out to borrowers, and they're going to do so at a higher interest rate, maybe 8%, and then they're netting the 2% between the two. So when we look at things like that, we really see that financial intermediaries, or this financial system that we've been talking about, really does bring together savers and borrowers. So let's look at this market, if you will. And again, it's bringing together savers and borrowers. And we look at it in a supply and demand diagram. We'll call it the quantity of loanable funds market. And here we're going to assume only one financial market, that everyone puts their savings into this market. Okay, there's not other things to choose from. Borrowers only take out loans from this market. And again, we're still in this closed economy, and we know in real life that doesn't exist. We're also going to say that there's only one interest rate. Okay, so savings. Savings is the source of loanable funds. Remember, we talked about national savings, and national savings is the source for funds in the loanable funds market. If you remember, we used GDP minus taxes. I'm sorry, that's wrong. GDP minus consumption minus government expenditures as what national savings means. We then broke that farther down into private savings by households, and we said that was GDP minus taxes minus consumption plus public savings, which is the government. And that is T minus G. If we add those two together, So again, we have GDP less taxes, less consumption, plus taxes minus government expenditures. Adding those two together, we get this national savings or savings. Remember what we said in a closed economy is that savings equals investment. So before I jump into that idea, I want to look more closely and use a graph to depict the supply of loanable funds or national savings. So here along the x-axis, we have the quantity of loanable funds. Along the y-axis over here, we have the interest rate. The supply of loanable funds is positively sloped, meaning if I took this and calculated the slope, we would see that it's positive. The positivity of this line tells us that there is a positive correlation between what is ever on the x-axis, in this case, loanable funds, and whatever's on the y-axis, in this case, the interest rate. When things are positively correlated, it means when one goes up, the other one goes up. And that kind of makes sense if you think about it, because these are savers. And what do savers want? Savers want a high interest rate. So when the interest rate increases, the quantity of loanable funds increases, all else held constant or other things equal. Ceteris paribus, if you prefer. That just basically means we're not changing anything else up. So there's a positive correlation to the supply curve. It is positively sloped because as the interest rate increases, the supply of loanable funds increases. So for example, if we had 8% interest here, I'm going to follow it over to my supply curve, drop it down. Notice that the quantity of loanable funds increases maybe to 120 billion. Okay. Okay. And again, just kind of looking at the difference here. Now, investment, I want you to think of it this way as the borrowers. And remember, an investment has that underlying physical asset. Some examples are listed here. Notice we say new homes because that is part of the investment category in how we define GDP. So here is the demand for loanable funds. The borrowers. Remember that national savings equals investment in a closed economy. So the demand for loanable funds is also the investment. People who want to build onto their business, maybe build a new home. Now think about people who borrow. People who borrow want a low interest rate. So as we look at this demand for loanable funds, notice that it has a negative slope. We would say it is negatively correlated between what is ever on the x-axis, in this case, the quantity of loanable funds, and the y-axis, which is the interest rate. So normally we would start with the y, but here the interest rate increases. What's going to happen to the quantity of loanable funds? Right, it's going to decrease. So they move opposite one another. If the interest rate goes down, the quantity of loanable funds will go up. So the investment portion here, or the demand for loanable funds, is negatively correlated. We can also see that here. If I say 5%, bring it over, drop it down here. So at 7%, we had 50 billion loanable funds. At 5%, we have maybe 80 billion loanable funds, showing that negative correlation between the interest rate and the quantity of, interest rate, yeah, and the quantity of loanable funds. Let me erase that so it's not so hard to read. Now we have the supply. Remember, this is national savings. And we have demand for loanable funds, which is investment. We said in a closed economy that savings equals investment, and that's going to happen right here, where the supply of loanable funds is equal to the demand of loanable funds. And that's going to be the prevailing interest rate. Here, it'll be 5%. And we're going to go ahead and drop this down, and this will be the quantity of loanable funds. And let's say that's 100. Now this 5% we would call the interest equilibrium, because it's where the two are equal, national savings and investment. And we would call the 100 the quantity of loanable funds at equilibrium. Okay, if the interest rate is below equilibrium, then we have a shortage of loanable funds. If the interest rate is above equilibrium, then we have a surplus. So let's go ahead and just take a look at each of these really closely, or a little bit. So again, quantity of loanable funds, interest rate. Here is our equilibrium. Previous slide we just kind of saw. And I'm just going to use that 5% and 100. Now, if the interest rate is below the 5%, below equilibrium, so let me change up a color here so I can get you really able to understand here. Come on. Sure. Okay. So let's say the interest rate's at 3%. Then the supply of loanable funds would be right here at something less than 100. So this is the quantity of loanable funds supplied. Pretty low. And yet at 3%, a bunch of people want loans. So the quantity, the demand for loanable funds would be in excess of 100. So this would be the quantity of loanable funds demanded. When supply is less than demand, or the demand is greater than the supply, whichever way you want to look at it, then we have a shortage. And we're going to see in upcoming chapters, what do we do then when we have a shortage? Whereas if we have an interest rate that is above, I'm going to change my ink color here real quick. I say real quick, but it all depends on how quickly that my stuff responds to me. Okay, so here's again, loanable funds market. Here's our demand for loanable funds, supply of loanable funds, and our equilibrium interest rate at 5%. And we'll just say 100. And then we're going to see what happens if we are, if the interest rate is above equilibrium. So let's say we're at 8% here. If we're at 8%, the demand for loanable funds is pretty low, right? Something less than 100, maybe 50. Yet the supply of loanable funds, all of them that are out there, might be something is going to be greater than 100, so like 150. So what we have here is where the supply of loanable funds is greater than the demand for loanable funds. And that's going to create a surplus of loanable funds. In this case, 100 billion, if we're looking at it that way. And again, we will see what happens in upcoming chapters with that surplus or that shortage in terms of other economies that we might look at. Last lecture for chapter 27. And we're going to take a look at what we call the efficient market hypothesis, discuss a little bit about markets, and kind of how all this works. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into it. share my screen with you. Go ahead and start my slideshow. There we are. Okay, so we're going to take a look at the principles underneath a thing called the efficient market hypothesis. I probably shouldn't say principles because they are not principles. The efficient market hypothesis, the lowdown of it is that whatever the stock price is, and you watched me kind of look up a stock price for AT&T earlier. We said it was what, $30.16. Now that $30.16 reflects all, that's the key, publicly available information about the stock price of AT&T. So this means that everything that has been talked about happening with AT&T is open to public awareness. Now, again, each company is closely monitored by money managers, and that's why you kind of hire someone to do this on a full-time basis. So let's just say AT&T was talking about some new technologies. Well, that information about that new technology is already in the stock price, which is published. Therefore, having a tip, inside information, and those things don't happen in the efficient market hypothesis. Now, again, there might be insider trading and illegal things happening, true, but there's no way to corner this market because all of the publicly available information is already in the $30.16. Now, what if you have proprietary information? Well, that's where we get into insider trading. Oddly enough, the Trump administration is being, let me back up. The Environmental Protection Agency is being sued, okay, by another part of the government, which is kind of interesting, the Federal Trade Commission. So there are some issues surrounding this. There is a company which mines in, I believe, Canada, and the EPA was going to allow additional mining, okay? And what happened was, because they thought things were going to go their way, there were some individuals in administration during the Trump administration who acted on that information, bought the stock of the Canadian company, and when they did that, then the EPA released the announcement. So notice the announcement wasn't available to the public. Only a select few were able to get that information. Now, many green movement groups, for lack of a better term, have now asked the Federal Trade Commission to look into the EPA's release of the announcement. And did they leak that announcement to a few in the cabinet who acted on it and bought stock? And if they did, then that is insider trading, which is illegal. So the Federal Trade Commission at this point today has not picked up that case. They don't really want to look into it. They don't want to look into the other arm, okay, of government, which kind of makes sense in a way. In a way, it doesn't. Okay, so when we talk about this is a supply and demand that should be setting the market price. Now, if we believe in the efficient market hypothesis, the first thing we have to resign ourselves to is that there is informational efficiency. Now, what does that mean? It means everyone has the same availability and the same access to information. And based upon everything that we're hearing about, we know there is not a level playing field for anyone. It could be gender, it could be race, it could be ethnicity, it could be living environment, it could be socioeconomic status. All of these things might hinder access. So I have a little trouble with the idea that we all have access to information. Yes, we might have the access, but do we have the knowledge
to get to the information that we need. Do we know that we should be following X, Y, or Z? So this is again why I trust my money to a full-time person, that's all they do. So the second, again, with this informational efficiency, and the second part of this is rationally reflect. So what do we mean by rational individuals? Well, we mean that a rational individual will do something as long as the benefit of that is greater than the cost. So my question then becomes, does everyone act rationally? So I kind of have a little issue with the idea. But here's the total implication of the efficient market hypothesis is that stock prices should in fact be random. And the only thing that should affect a stock price is information that wasn't publicly available. So a natural disaster, an act of God, something that happened that was totally unforeseen should be the only thing affecting stock prices. Okay, so again, it's an idea, and again, theory. So I love that Mankiw really points out, he's your author, really does point out the idea that this is a theory. Okay, it's not really been proven. It's not completely true, because we know that traders, for example, have access to supercomputers, right? And those supercomputers might be able to process information faster. If I can process it faster, then I can get into the market earlier and maybe make more money than someone else. So that's kind of where I'm coming from this. Even if it's not exactly a random walk, it is close. So, okay, if you are following everything you should be following, right? The knowledge, and you're able to see the big picture. One of my favorite shows is Billions, and I like it because it's a bunch of traders, and they're talking a lot about how they see things in the grand scheme. If this happens in this country, and that will impact this, and this will impact this, and so on. And it kind of goes all over all of the things that have to gel together in order to really make good money in the stock market. Now, there's another, how can you kind of get that proprietary knowledge without having the proprietary knowledge? And a lot of people, again, will use an index fund. We talked about index funds, mutual funds. I showed you some examples prior. Now, some funds are actively managed. And again, if you're going to be doing this, it's entirely up to you. But you might have a professional portfolio manager. That's what I have, okay? And they buy only the best stocks based upon your beta risk, based upon your long-term investing goals, and they do tend to look at things more long-term. These, the performance of index funds, because it is not an in and out daily situation. So they're not pulling your money out and pulling your money in at every moment. Interestingly enough, my active portfolio manager only during the coronavirus has been sending out weekly emails to say, don't panic, don't do a panic sell during this time. You know, we structure you for the longer term, and this too will resolve itself. And yes, you've lost a lot of money, but you know what? You're already up a lot of money. So there's some interesting things about this, particularly in the previous objective, we talked about risk. And it's not good to look at your portfolio on a daily basis. It's actually good to look at it maybe once every 6 months, maybe once a year, because you might make decisions that you would regret later on. And we want to try to avoid all of that regret. So active portfolio managers they have a lower return. Okay, so less risk, right? So lower the risk. Okay. They might trade more frequently if they don't have a long-term plan for you. So I think the best thing is to have a manager of your portfolio, and that manager you never really talk to. The person that you talk to is your advisor. Okay. Now, I have an advisor who works with a manager. I never talk to the manager. I trust the advisor that they know what they're doing. One of the things you really have to be careful of, particularly in all of these funds, mutual funds, managers, and so on, are fees. Because if you thought your banking fees were hard to understand, financial investing is 10 times worse. Because when I was doing this, we would charge a front fee, a fee every time we sold something, every time we made a call for something. It's a lot like a lawyer, you know, lots and lots of fees. So, you know, so lots of different fees that we would have. Okay. Again, efficient market hypothesis. What's the big assumption is that people buying and selling stock are rational, because the behavior of a large market maker or several individuals will affect the stock market. So here's a really stupid but great example. When the coronavirus happened, okay, what happened to the price of Corona beer? And is that rational? And we'd say, absolutely not. But the price of Corona beer plummeted. There's no relationship that I know of, but again, so when we talk about stock prices, there is a psychological component to it. We are still irrational beings. And that's why I do love the book by Akerhoff and Schiller that talks about us just really being very developed animals. And we have herd instincts and we follow things. And, you know, I have horses, and it's funny, if a leaf blows across the pasture, one of them will go, oh my gosh, we're going to die. And the other ones are like, I don't know why we're going to die, but we're going to die. And then they're all running all over, being all crazy. And it's just because one saw a leaf out of the corner of their eye, and they've seen leaves so many times. But again, well-developed animals. Okay, so kind of interesting when you think about it. We've already talked about asset valuation, okay, above its fundamental value or overvalued, and we might then be looking at a bubble. And a bubble is it's based upon irrationality of it's what demand and supply of people acting in the market is what's driving up the price, okay? So, for example, if I decided to sell all of my shares right now, and I'll just use CSX, then what would happen is if other people did as well, they saw me selling, now the price is going to go down, and then others are going to sell off, and then the price is going to go down. And that's a lot of what you've seen during the coronavirus in the stock market happening. Again, are there speculative bubbles? Yes. Right now, the ones that we're watching are the student loans, because student loans are bought and sold in the secondary market. And so some economists are predicting that it will go the fate of the housing market. Okay, so kind of the same thing might happen. All right, so again, here's the debate among economists. And this is what we like to talk about when we all get together. Sounds really boring, right? Because it kind of is. You know, what are these departures from rational pricing? Why is this happening? Why are people doing what they're doing, and so on? And again, there's another great book. It's called Irrational Exuberance, and that was a term coined by first John Maynard Keynes, and then Greenspan, Alan Greenspan, who was chairman of the Federal Reserve, talked about irrational exuberance in the market. So it's really hard to explain why people do what they do. And if we all could figure it out, we all would need to work, and there really would be no market, because what would be the point? So impossible to know the correct rational valuation of a company, because it really is, we don't have all of the information that we need. And so, okay, so that is the end of chapter 27, this objective. And so I think we have one more chapter in this part, which is chapter 28, unemployment. And then we will be ready for, I think, our third test. And that's over 25, 26, 27, and 28. So thanks for your time, attention. I'll see you back in chapter 28.